The air was thick with smoke and desperation outside the walls of Vienna in the year 1683. A vast Ottoman army, one of the most formidable forces the world had ever seen, had surrounded the city, determined to break through its defenses and claim it for their empire. The fate of Europe hung in the balance. This was not just a battle for territory, but a clash of civilizations. The defenders, outnumbered and exhausted, faced what seemed like inevitable defeat. But then, something extraordinary happened. Through a combination of cunning, courage, and 25 meticulously crafted tactical masterplans, the tide of the siege began to turn. These strategies, born from the brink of disaster, didn't just save Vienna, they reshaped the course of history. What made these plans so effective? How did a coalition of outnumbered forces manage to outthink and outmaneuver one of the most powerful empires of its time? The answers lie in the brilliance of leadership, the power of innovation, and the unyielding resilience of those who refused to surrender. These weren't just battlefield tactics, they were lessons in human ingenuity, forged under the most extreme pressure. And here's the remarkable thing, these strategies aren't locked away in the past. The same principles that turned the tide at Vienna can teach us how to face our own challenges today, whether in business, leadership, or personal struggles. This is the story of those 25 masterplans, a journey through one of history's most dramatic sieges and the tactical genius that defined it. We'll uncover how clever deception, bold alliances, and relentless adaptability shattered the Ottoman advance, and how these timeless strategies still resonate centuries later. By the end, you won't just see history differently, you'll see your own battles through a new lens. So let's step back into that smoke-filled September, where every decision mattered, and discover the secrets that saved a continent. By the late 17th century, the Ottoman Empire stood at the height of its power, stretching across 3 continents and commanding armies that struck fear into the hearts of Europe. For decades, the sultans had expanded their reach, pushing deeper into Christian lands with each campaign. Vienna wasn't just another city, it was the glittering prize, the gateway to Central Europe. If it fell, the road to Rome itself could lie open. The Holy Roman Empire, fractured by religious wars and internal rivalries, seemed ill-prepared to stop the tide. Yet Vienna was more than a strategic target, it was a symbol. Holding it meant preserving the cultural and political order of Europe, while losing it could rewrite the map forever. The Ottomans didn't just bring overwhelming numbers to the siege, they brought a playbook honed over centuries. Their engineers were masters of tunneling beneath city walls, planting explosives to shatter defenses. Their Janissaries, elite soldiers trained from childhood, were relentless in assault, and their commander, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, was a man with everything to prove. His reputation, even his life, depended on delivering victory. Against him stood 2 unlikely allies, King John III Sobieski of Poland, a warrior king known for his daring cavalry charges, and Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, the unyielding governor of Vienna. Neither man could afford to fail, but their forces were dwarfed, their supplies dwindling. Yet desperation has a way of sharpening the mind. As the Ottomans tightened their grip, the defenders knew brute force alone wouldn't save them. They needed something smarter, something unexpected. The first Masterplan emerged not from a council of generals, but from the streets of Vienna itself. Ordinary citizens working alongside soldiers devised a way to turn the Ottomans' greatest strength, their siege tunnels, against them. By flooding the underground passages with water and debris, they turned the enemy's engineering into a death trap. It was a small victory, but it proved something vital. even against impossible odds, ingenuity could tip the scales, and this was only the beginning. The reinforced walls of Vienna were far more than just stone and mortar. They were the first masterstroke in a desperate bid for survival. When the Ottoman threat loomed, the city's outdated medieval fortifications stood little chance against the massive cannons of the invading army. But Vienna's defenders refused to wait for defeat. In a race against time, engineers and laborers transformed the city's defenses, layering modern bastions and sloping earthworks designed to absorb cannon fire. These weren't just walls, they were a labyrinth of death for any attacker. Hidden traps were embedded in the structures, from concealed spikes to murder holes where defenders could rain down fire on anyone who breached the outer layers. At the heart of this transformation was Georg Rimpler, a visionary military engineer whose designs revolutionized siege defense. He understood that static walls would crumble under relentless bombardment, so he crafted a system of overlapping defenses, each layer weaker than the last, forcing the Ottomans to fight for every inch. The outer earthworks slowed their advance, while inner bastions provided elevated platforms for Vienna's cannons to retaliate. Rimpler's genius wasn't just in construction, it was in psychology. By making the walls seem impregnable, he sapped the morale of the Ottoman sappers, who soon realized breaching them would cost far more lives than they'd anticipated. The Ottomans, expecting a swift victory, found themselves bogged down in a grueling siege. Every day spent tunneling, bombarding, or assaulting the walls drained their supplies and stretched their supply lines thin. Meanwhile, Vienna's reinforced defenses bought the defenders something even more valuable than stone: time. Time to coordinate with allies, time to restock dwindling ammunition, and time to devise even more audacious countermeasures. But walls alone couldn't win a siege. Communication was the lifeline that kept the city from collapsing. As the Ottomans grew frustrated, Vienna's leaders were already working on the next Masterplan, one that would turn the tide not with bricks but with whispers in the dark. Even as Vienna's walls held firm, the defenders faced another deadly challenge: isolation. Cut off from the outside world by the Ottoman siege, the city risked losing not just supplies but hope. That's when the second Masterplan ignited across the rooftops, a sophisticated beacon signal system that turned the night sky into a canvas of coded messages. Flames flickering from church towers and watchposts weren't just random fires, they were a lifeline, whispering secrets to allies miles beyond the enemy's reach. The system was deceptively simple yet brilliantly effective. Different sequences of flames conveyed everything from urgent requests for reinforcements to coded reports of Ottoman troop movements. A single torch flaring twice might signal a successful sabotage operation, while 3 quick bursts could warn of an impending tunnel attack. These weren't just practical messages, they were psychological weapons. When exhausted defenders saw distant peaks answering Vienna's signals with their own fiery replies, it shattered the illusion of abandonment. The beacons screamed to friend and foe alike, "You haven't broken us yet." But fires alone couldn't carry every detail. That's where the runners came in, shadowy figures who slipped through Ottoman lines under cover of darkness. One teenager, disguised as a fruit vendor, memorized entire troop dispositions by counting the number of cooking fires in enemy camps. Another swam the Danube with dispatches sewn into his hat, dodging patrol boats by clinging to drifting debris. These weren't trained spies, they were ordinary people performing extraordinary acts, proving that courage could outmaneuver sheer numbers. The true genius of this system lay in its adaptability. When Ottoman forces caught on and began mimicking signals, Vienna's signalers introduced rotating ciphers, changing patterns daily to baffle interceptors. It was an early form of encryption, turning every flicker into a puzzle only allies could solve. This constant innovation kept the Ottomans guessing while ensuring vital intelligence reached Poland's King John III Sobieski as he marshaled his legendary Winged Hussars for the relief force. Yet the beacon network did more than transmit information, it sustained the city's soul. As food stores dwindled and cannon fire shook the streets, the nightly dance of flames reminded Vienna that help was coming. That stubborn refusal to surrender, to keep signaling even when the horizon seemed empty, became a self-fulfilling prophecy, because hidden in those flickering codes was the next masterstroke already taking shape, a campaign not of steel, but of whispers designed to unravel the enemy's will. The Ottomans would soon learn that Vienna fought not just with swords, but with shadows. As the siege wore on, Vienna's defenders realized brute force alone wouldn't break the Ottoman grip. They needed to wage war on the enemy's mind. The third Masterplan was a masterpiece of deception, turning the fog of war into their greatest weapon. When Ottoman scouts reported gaps in the city's defenses, they weren't witnessing a collapse. They were stumbling into an elaborate trap. Defenders staged fake retreats, abandoning sections of the outer walls only to lure attackers into narrow kill zones where hidden cannons and musketeers waited. The Ottomans, expecting victory, instead found themselves funneled into slaughterhouses of crossfire, but the psychological assault didn't stop there. Under cover of darkness, Vienna's soldiers became ghosts. They rigged dummies' straw-filled uniforms propped on poles along the ramparts, tricking Ottoman snipers into wasting ammunition on lifeless targets. Others dragged empty carts through the streets, the rattle of wheels echoing like reinforcements arriving. One particularly clever ruse involved beating drums and clanging pots from multiple directions at once, convincing sleep-deprived Ottoman troops that a massive night assault was underway. Accounts from captured soldiers later described entire regiments firing at shadows, convinced they were facing an invisible army. The most devastating blow to Ottoman morale came from a seemingly small detail: the defenders' refusal to act like a besieged city. While the Ottomans expected despair, they heard laughter and music drifting from Vienna's walls at night. Bands played deliberately loud concerts on the ramparts, not just to lift spirits but to signal unshaken defiance. This wasn't just noise, it was psychological warfare, a calculated reminder that the enemy's efforts were futile. These tricks preyed on a fundamental truth: even the mightiest army fights with two weapons, steel and belief. Every false retreat, every echoing drumbeat chipped away at the Ottoman certainty. By the time Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa realized his troops were chasing illusions, their confidence was already crumbling. Yet Vienna's defenders knew deception alone couldn't win the siege. Their greatest strength wasn't just trickery, it was the ability to adapt, to turn even the most mundane resources into weapons. And as the Ottomans' frustration grew, the stage was set for an even bolder gambit, one that would transform the city's deadliest weakness into its salvation. With food supplies dwindling and the Ottoman noose tightening, Vienna's defenders made a brutal calculation. If they couldn't hold the countryside, they'd ensure the enemy couldn't use it either. The fourth Masterplan was one of sacrifice, scorched earth and poisoned wells. Farmers who had spent generations tending their fields now watched as soldiers torched their own harvests, black smoke curling over orchards and grain stores that might have fed the invaders. Vineyards were uprooted, livestock driven into the city or slaughtered where they stood. Even water sources weren't spared. Defenders dumped rotting carcasses and bitter herbs into wells, rendering them undrinkable. The human cost was staggering. One elderly widow, when ordered to abandon her cottage so it could be burned, insisted on staying long enough to retrieve her late husband's war medals from the rafters. A miller poisoned his own flour stores with harmless but foul-tasting additives, knowing Ottoman foragers would reject it as spoiled. These weren't acts of military strategists, but ordinary people choosing collective survival over individual survival. Their defiance came at a price. When the siege lifted, many returned to find their livelihoods ashes. Ethically, the tactic walked a razor's edge. Denying resources to an invading force was justifiable, but poisoning wells risked harming innocent Ottoman camp followers and even future generations through contaminated groundwater. Modern parallels abound, from Russian forces burning crops in Ukraine to ancient strategies like Carthage salting its own fields against Rome. The lesson Vienna teaches isn't just about destruction, but about the calculus of desperation. When facing annihilation, even terrible choices become tools. Yet scorched earth alone couldn't break the siege. What Vienna needed wasn't just denial, but reinforcement, and that demanded something far more complex than burning fields. It demanded turning rivals into allies, stitching together a coalition from fragments of distrust. As smoke still hung over the countryside, messengers were already galloping west with urgent appeals, setting in motion the fifth Masterplan, diplomacy as deadly as any cannon. The fractured kingdoms of Europe had spent centuries at each other's throats. Polish nobles distrusted German princes, Catholic rulers clashed with Protestants, and old grudges festered like unhealed wounds. Yet when Vienna's beacon screamed for help, King John III Sobieski of Poland did the unthinkable. He set aside generations of rivalry to forge the Holy League. This wasn't just an alliance of convenience, it was a diplomatic miracle. Sobieski's letters to Leopold I of Austria didn't gloss over their mutual disdain, they acknowledged it openly. The Turk at our gates cares not for the quarrels of Christians. One dispatch read, a blunt reminder that survival demanded unity. The negotiations were anything but smooth. German electors balked at placing their troops under Polish command. Bavarian cavalry officers refused to share supplies with Saxon infantry. Even the papal envoy struggled to mediate, at one point threatening to withhold church funds unless bickering commanders ceased their squabbles. What broke the deadlock wasn't lofty idealism, but cold pragmatism. Sobieski's envoys circulated detailed maps showing Ottoman supply routes, proof that if Vienna fell, no European capital would be safe. The message was clear: stand together now or perish separately later. When the coalition finally marched, it moved with startling coordination. Polish Winged Hussars, Europe's most feared cavalry, rode alongside Austrian artillery and Bavarian pikemen in a column stretching 12 miles. Their rendezvous at Tulln, just northwest of Vienna, became a masterclass in operational secrecy. Scouts spread misinformation about their numbers, while blacksmiths muffled horseshoes with rags to mute the army's approach. The Ottomans, fixated on the city's walls, failed to notice the gathering storm until it was too late. The Battle of Colinburg on September 12, 1683, revealed the alliance's true genius. Sobieski didn't just attack, he orchestrated a symphony of violence. German infantry pinned the Ottoman flank with disciplined volleys, while Polish cavalry waited like a coiled spring. At the decisive moment, 18,000 horsemen charged down the hillside, their iconic wings whistling in the wind. The impact was catastrophic. Ottoman chroniclers later wrote of iron horses breathing fire, their lines collapsing under the weight of a unified Christian hammer blow. Modern military strategists still study Kahlenberg as the birth of coalition warfare. Like NATO operations or multinational peacekeeping forces today, its success hinged on standardizing communication. Sobieski's commanders used a shared system of flag signals to coordinate across language barriers. The parallel runs deeper. Just as the Holy League overcame cultural divides to face a common threat, 21st century alliances must balance national interests against global challenges. Yet for all its brilliance, the cavalry charge was merely the exclamation point on a far subtler strategy. As Ottoman forces reeled from Colinburg, Vienna's defenders launched their sixth Masterplan, one that weaponized the enemy's own strength against them. The Janissaries, elite warriors who had once seemed invincible, were about to meet their match not on the battlefield but in the shadows of their own camp. The ground trembled under a sound like rolling thunder as 18,000 Polish Winged Hussars crested the Colinburg heights. Sunlight glinted off their iconic wings, curved wooden frames adorned with eagle feathers that hissed like a storm wind as they charged. To the Ottoman forces below, it must have seemed as if the sky itself was descending upon them. These weren't just cavalrymen, they were a psychological weapon incarnate. Their layered armor, a blend of chainmail and steel plates, made them nearly impervious to arrows, while their signature lances, some stretching 18 feet long, could skewer 3 men in a single thrust. But the true power of the Hussars lay in their discipline. Unlike the wild charges of other cavalry, they moved as a single, terrifying wave, holding formation until the final moments before impact. Eyewitness accounts from both sides describe the charge in near-mythic terms. A Venetian diplomat wrote of a forest of lances blotting out the sun, while an Ottoman scribe lamented that the very air screamed with the wings of avenging angels. The psychological shock was immediate. Janissaries who had stood firm against volleys of gunfire now broke ranks, some dropping their weapons to claw at their own faces in terror. The wings weren't just decoration, they amplified the riders' silhouettes, making each Hussar appear twice his actual size. Combined with the deafening roar of feathers and hooves, the effect was paralyzing. Tactically, the charge was a masterpiece of timing. Sobieski had waited until the Ottoman forces were fully committed to their assault on Vienna's walls, their ranks stretched thin and their reserves exhausted. When the Hussars struck, they didn't just break the Ottoman line, they shattered it into fragments, sending shockwaves through the entire army. Supply trains overturned, artillery crews abandoned their posts, and even Kara Mustafa's elite guard faltered. The Grand Vizier himself barely escaped, leaving behind his ceremonial tent and a treasury of gold. Yet the Hussars' triumph wasn't just about brute force. Their charge exposed a fatal flaw in Ottoman logistics, an overstretched supply network. For months, the invaders had relied on plunder from the Austrian countryside to feed their massive army. Now, with supply lines severed and warehouses burning, starvation loomed. The Ottomans had gambled everything on a swift victory, and as the Hussars wheeled for a second charge, that gamble collapsed. But the defenders knew one spectacular charge couldn't end the siege alone. As the dust settled, Vienna's leaders were already executing the next Masterplan, one that would exploit the enemy's disarray not with lances, but with something far subtler, the power of perception. The Ottoman war machine was a beast that ran on grain, gunpowder, and gold cut its supply lines, and even the mightiest army would starve. That became the defenders' seventh Masterplan, a relentless campaign of ambushes and sabotage against Kara Mustafa's lifelines. Croatian light cavalry, masters of irregular warfare, became the ghosts of the Danube Valley. Riding nimble Balkan ponies, they struck at dusk when Ottoman supply trains lumbered through narrow mountain passes. One raid near Pressburg saw 300 Croatians roll burning barrels down a slope into a caravan of grain wagons, igniting a firestorm visible from Vienna's walls. These weren't pitched battles but surgical strikes, stealing ammunition crates, poisoning horse feed, even replacing gunpowder barrels with sand-filled decoys. A captured Ottoman quartermaster's diary lamented bread rations cut to 1 loaf per 5 men, with soldiers boiling leather straps for broth. The psychological toll was devastating. Elite Janissaries, accustomed to first pick of plunder, now brawled with cooks over moldy biscuits. Desertions spiked as conscripts from Egypt and Syria, already demoralized by the harsh climate, slipped away into the night. Modern militaries still study these tactics, from French resistance fighters sabotaging Nazi rail lines to Ukrainian partisans disrupting Russian fuel depots. The principle remains: logistics are an army's Achilles heel. What made Vienna's approach unique was its precision. Instead of indiscriminate destruction, they targeted specific vulnerabilities, like intercepting shipments of lead for bullet casting, forcing Ottoman musketeers to fire stones or broken pottery. Yet starving an enemy requires more than raids, it demands deception. As Ottoman foragers grew desperate, Vienna's spies circulated forged maps leading to barren fields or ambush sites. One ingenious trick involved leaving counterfeit supply requests in abandoned camps, tricking Ottoman scouts into redirecting convoys to non-existent ally positions. This web of lies set the stage for the Eighth Masterplan, where truth itself would become a weapon sharper than any saber. Rumors became Vienna's deadliest weapon, not whispered in back alleys but broadcast with theatrical precision. The Eighth Masterplan transformed misinformation into an art form. One morning, Ottoman pickets discovered a blood-stained rider slumped near their lines, moaning about 100,000 German reinforcements crossing the Danube. The man was a Habsburg dragoon, his wounds real but self-inflicted, his uniform deliberately tattered to sell the lie. By sundown, panic had infected the Ottoman ranks. Kara Mustafa's officers interrogated the deserter, unaware he'd been carefully coached with false troop numbers and marching routes designed to sound plausible. The deception grew bolder. Defenders launched parchment balloons carrying forged letters supposedly between Polish generals that accidentally drifted into Ottoman camps. One such note detailed imaginary regiments of Swedish mercenaries approaching from the north, complete with convincing wax seals. Another slip of paper, slipped into a dead courier's pouch, listed fictitious supply depots along the Ottoman retreat path. These weren't haphazard tricks but psychological precision strikes. Ottoman commanders wasted precious days diverting scouts to verify phantom threats, their trust in intelligence eroding by the hour. Yet this strategy walked an ethical tightrope. Medieval codes of honor condemned lying in warfare, and some Viennese clergy initially protested the ruses. The defenders justified their actions with grim pragmatism. Every rumor that delayed an assault saved civilian lives. Modern parallels echo from World War II's ghost army deception units to digital disinformation campaigns today. The lesson isn't that deceit wins wars, but that controlling an enemy's perception can be as decisive as any battlefield victory. As Ottoman morale frayed, Vienna's engineers prepared their most audacious counterstroke yet. Beneath the very feet of the besiegers, a silent war was being waged, one that would turn the Ottomans' own tunneling tactics against them with brutal ingenuity. The next Masterplan didn't just defend the city, it rewrote the rules of underground warfare. Beneath Vienna's battered streets, a hidden war raged. One fought not with swords or cannons, but with pickaxes and candlelight. The Ottomans had mastered the art of tunneling, digging beneath city walls to plant explosive charges that could shatter fortifications in an instant. But Vienna's defenders refused to play defense underground. Their ninth Masterplan turned the tables, a network of countermines twisting like a labyrinth beneath the besieged city. Austrian sappers, many of them silver miners from the Tyrol, listened for the faintest scrape of Ottoman picks. their ears pressed to wooden sounding rods that amplified vibrations through the earth. When they detected enemy digging, they didn't just block the tunnels, they ambushed them. The clashes in these pitch-black corridors were nightmares of close-quarters combat. Zappers armed with pistols and hatchets would burst into Ottoman tunnels, igniting pre-positioned barrels of gunpowder to collapse entire sections. One particularly brutal encounter saw Austrians flood a Turkish tunnel with a noxious mix of smoke and quicklime, suffocating an entire digging team before they could retreat. The air down there was thick with dust and the reek of sweat, the only light coming from guttering candles that could ignite deadly pockets of methane. Men worked in shifts, their faces blackened by soot, knowing a single misstep could bury them alive. What made this subterranean war so revolutionary was its precision. Unlike earlier sieges where countermining was haphazard, Vienna's engineers mapped every tunnel with meticulous care, creating a three-dimensional battlefield beneath the surface. They even developed early versions of mine detectors, hollow copper balls filled with mercury that would tremble when enemy digging approached. Modern parallels are striking. From Viet Cong tunnel networks to Hammer's underground fortifications, the principles remain eerily similar. Yet Vienna's sappers had none of today's technology, relying instead on intuition and brutal ingenuity. The weather above ground became an unexpected ally. Heavy September rains turned Ottoman trenches into quagmires, while Vienna's countermines stayed dry thanks to clever drainage channels. As the Ottomans struggled with flooding tunnels and mud-clogged supply routes, the defenders launched their 10th Masterplan, one that weaponized the very climate against the invaders. The stage was set for nature itself to join the fight. The skies over Vienna cracked open in early September 1683, unleashing torrents that transformed the Ottoman siege works into a quagmire. What began as an inconvenience became the defenders' 10th Masterplan, an unspoken alliance with the elements. Ottoman trenches, painstakingly dug over weeks, collapsed into knee-deep sludge. Artillery carts sank to their axles, their precious cargo of cannonballs rendered useless. Even the Janissaries, famed for their discipline, struggled to reload muskets with rain-soaked powder. Meanwhile, Vienna's cobbled streets channeled the deluge into clever drainage ditches, keeping key defensive positions dry and mobile. Nature's cruelty was matched only by its timing. Just as Polish relief forces neared the city, thick autumn fog rolled in from the Danube, a gift the defenders exploited with ruthless efficiency. Scouts disguised as farmers slipped through the mist, planting false markers to redirect Ottoman patrols. Cavalry sorties appeared suddenly from the gloom, striking supply depots before vanishing like phantoms. The fog even masked the sounds of Sobieski's approaching army. Distant drumbeats and hoof falls were muffled until the last critical hours. Ottoman sentries later reported seeing shadows move within shadows, their nerves fraying with every imagined attack. History brims with battles decided by whether Napoleon's frozen retreat from Moscow, the D-Day landings timed between channel storms. But Vienna's defenders did more than endure the elements, they weaponized them. When the rain ceased, they deliberately flooded abandoned tunnels to create stagnant pools breeding disease. They timed counterattacks for moments when the sun blinded Ottoman archers. Even the wind became an ally, carrying the stench of unburied Ottoman dead toward enemy lines to sicken living troops. Yet no force of nature compared to the storm brewing within Vienna's walls, not from soldiers, but from seamstresses, blacksmiths, and children too young to lift a sword. As the rain finally eased, the 11th Masterplan emerged not from the command tents, but from the desperate ingenuity of ordinary citizens. Their contributions would prove that courage wears many faces, and that even a baker's shovel could become a weapon when survival hung in the balance. When the professional soldiers faltered, Vienna's streets erupted with a different kind of warrior, the butcher wielding his cleaver, the university student hurling roof tiles, the elderly nun melting down church candlesticks for musket balls. This was the 11th Masterplan, turning every citizen into a soldier. Barricades rose like sudden mountains, cobblestones torn up by women in blood-stained aprons, furniture piled high by children too small to peer over the top. A famed baker, his shop reduced to rubble, repurposed his bread shovels into lethal pikes, leading a charge that reclaimed a key intersection near St. Stephen's Cathedral. Even the city's priests traded vestments for armor, one famously swinging a censer like a flail to hold off Janissaries at a breached gate. Their weapons were as inventive as their courage. Apothecaries boiled cauldrons of lye to pour on scaling ladders. Street gangs who'd once brawled over tavern debts now coordinated ambushes using chimney tops as sniper nests. A choir master, his music hall destroyed, redirected his choir boys to whistle Ottoman battle calls from alleyways, confusing enemy regiments into firing on each other. These weren't trained combatants, they were people defending their homes with whatever lay at hand, proving that desperation could forge genius. Modern parallels shine through history's lens. The French Resistance's garage built explosives, Syrian rebels repurposing irrigation pipes into rockets, even Ukrainian grandmothers making Molotov cocktails, all echo Vienna's spirit of grassroots defiance. But what set these citizens apart wasn't just their scrappiness, it was their organization. Neighborhood captains relayed orders through coded church bells, while midwives doubled as medics, using linen torn from wedding dresses to bandage wounds. This wasn't chaos, it was community weaponized. Yet for all their bravery, the militias had one critical weakness. Without accurate intelligence, even the fiercest barricade would fail. That's where Vienna's most unexpected spies entered the fray: merchants, beggars, even Ottoman deserters who switched sides not for gold, but for promises of safe passage. Their whispers would fuel the 12th Masterplan, turning the enemy's own ranks into a funnel of secrets. As the citizen fighters held the line, a shadow war of information was already unfolding, one that would prove knowledge could be deadlier than any blade. In the shadowy corners of the Ottoman siege camps, where lantern light flickered across maps marked with assault plans, Vienna's most unlikely weapons moved silently: a disgruntled supply clerk, a homesick Hungarian mercenary, even a laundress with a knack for memorizing the stains on officers' correspondence. The 12th Masterplan thrived on betrayal, not of ideals but of desperation. One particularly daring double agent, a Greek interpreter named Dimitri, smuggled out sketches of tunnel routes by hiding them inside hollowed-out loaves of bread, each delivery timed to coincide with garbage disposal runs. The risks were unimaginable. Ottoman counterintelligence officers nailed captured spies to planks and floated them down the Danube as warnings, yet the rewards outweighed the terror. When Dimitri's bread loaves revealed the location of a massive gunpowder depot, Viennese artillery reduced it to rubble in a single, earth-shaking volley. Then there was the maid, a young woman named Elżbieta, hired to scrub floors in Kara Mustafa's headquarters, overheard conversations about a planned midnight assault on the Lurbilbaste bastion, slipped into her laundry basket, coded into the stitching of a handkerchief passed to a milk vendor. Her intelligence allowed defenders to reinforce the weak point with hidden caltrops and pre-aimed cannons. When the Ottoman attack came, they marched into a slaughterhouse of their own making. This wasn't just espionage, it was a symphony of small betrayals, each note perfectly timed to unravel the enemy's strategy. Modern cyber espionage operates on similar principles: whistleblowers leaking data through encrypted channels, hackers planting false blueprints in enemy servers. The tools have changed, but the game remains the same. Information is the ultimate lever, and the right whisper at the right time can topple empires. Vienna's spies understood this instinctively, turning the Ottomans' own camps into echo chambers of misinformation. But while shadows danced behind enemy lines, another revolution was brewing under the command of a brilliant artillery officer named Georg von Rimpler. His next innovation would redefine siege warfare, blending raw firepower with geometric precision to create a killing field the Ottomans never saw coming. The spies had set the stage, now it was time for the guns to speak. The thunder of cannons had always been the soundtrack of siege warfare, but Vienna's defenders rewrote the score. The 13th Masterplan transformed artillery from lumbering beasts into nimble predators, thanks to a young Italian engineer named Luigi Ferdinando Marsigli. While Ottoman gunners struggled to reposition their massive bronze cannons, Marsigli designed lightweight field guns mounted on reinforced carts. These weren't just mobile, they were musical, their crews dancing them across the battlefield like chess pieces. A single unit could fire from the rooftops of a burning house at dawn, then reappear by midday near a breached gate, leaving the Ottomans shelling empty rubble. Marsigli's genius lay in simplicity. His guns sacrificed sheer firepower for speed, using standardized ammunition that cut reloading time in half. Crews trained relentlessly, hitting predetermined firing positions with stopwatch precision. One eyewitness described how Austrian gunners dismantled their weapon mid-retreat, carried the parts through a sewer tunnel, and had it reassembled and firing before Ottoman scouts realized they'd been flanked. This was artillery as performance art, each shot calculated not just for damage, but to sow confusion. When the Ottomans massed for an assault near the Berg Gate, Marsigli's guns unleashed a barrage of hollow iron spheres filled with shrapnel and sulfur, creating a makeshift chemical weapon that choked attackers in acrid smoke. The psychological impact was devastating. Ottoman sappers, accustomed to static cannon emplacements, found themselves hunted. Just as they'd mark a battery's location for avoidance, the guns would vanish, only to reappear where least expected. Marsigli even employed decoy positions, abandoned earthworks with dummy cannons made of painted logs, to bait enemy bombardments into wasting precious powder. Modern militaries would later codify these tactics as shoot and scoot, but in 1683 they were revolutionary. For the first time, artillery wasn't just supporting infantry, it was dictating the battle's rhythm. Yet mobility came at a cost. Lighter guns meant shorter range and reduced structural integrity. Marsigli's journals reveal sleepless nights recalculating trajectories as barrels warped from overuse. When one cannon exploded during a rapid redeployment, killing its entire crew, the engineer personally redesigned the carriage suspension system overnight. His solution, leather straps soaked in vinegar to absorb recoil, a makeshift innovation that became standard for European field artillery for decades. As Ottoman assaults grew more desperate, Vienna's medical teams faced a grim tide of shattered limbs and cannon wounds. But just as Marsigli redefined artillery, an unassuming army surgeon named Gottfried Welsch was quietly revolutionizing another facet of war, the science of saving lives. His field hospitals would become the 14th Masterplan, proving that survival wasn't just about killing the enemy, but preserving your own. Blood and bandages became Vienna's unexpected weapons against the siege silent killer, disease. While cannon fire and cavalry charges dominated the battlefield, the 14th Masterplan unfolded in candlelit cellars where surgeon Gottfried Welsch transformed butcher's blocks into operating tables. His field hospitals were revolutionary not for their tools, rusty saws and bone needles, but for their system. Wounded soldiers weren't left to rot in alleys. They were triaged by severity, with the lightly injured sent back to the walls after quick stitches, while the gravely hurt received opium-laced wine before amputations. Even the Ottomans took note, their own chronicles grudgingly admiring how Christian doctors could salvage 3 of every 5 wounded, compared to their own 1 in 10. Quarantine zones, an idea borrowed from Venetian plague defenses, became lifelines. Soldiers with dysentery or fever were isolated in repurposed wine cellars, their bedding burned daily to halt contagion. Herbalists scoured the city for garlic and sage, boiling them into antiseptic poultices that stank but saved limbs from gangrene. A nun named Sister Margareta discovered that moss packed into wounds slowed bleeding better than linen, a trick she'd learned from observing deer rub their injuries against forest growth. These weren't just medical advances, they were morale multipliers. When exhausted defenders saw their comrades carried gently indoors rather than abandoned, it whispered a powerful truth: you matter enough to be saved. The parallels to modern combat medicine are striking. Welsh's emphasis on staged evacuations mirrors today's golden hour trauma protocols, while his quarantine measures foreshadowed infection control in field hospitals from the American Civil War to Afghanistan. But perhaps his most enduring legacy was psychological. By valuing every life, even that of a lowly militiaman, Vienna's medics reinforced the city's collective will. A soldier fighting for comrades who'll retrieve him under fire fights harder than one who expects to be left for dead. Yet medicine alone couldn't break the siege. As Welsh's scalpels carved hope from despair, another quiet revolution was unfolding, this one in the hands of Vienna's blacksmiths and carpenters. Their 15th Masterplan would prove that innovation wasn't just about new weapons, but reimagining old ones. The city's workshops buzzed with monstrous creations, each designed to exploit the Ottomans' most vulnerable moment, the instant their ladders touched the walls. The cathedral bells that had once called Vienna's faithful to prayer now lay in molten heaps, their sacred bronze reforged into instruments of war. This was the 15th Masterplan, a desperate alchemy that turned symbols of peace into tools of survival. With metal supplies dwindling, the city's blacksmiths faced an agonizing choice: melt down the towering church bells or watch their cannons fall silent. The decision split the clergy. Some priests wept as centuries-old bells, inscribed with prayers and the names of long-dead benefactors, were dragged from belfries. Others saw divine providence in the act, quoting scripture about beating swords into plowshares. Only now, the verse ran backward. The process itself was a feat of ingenuity. Bell metal, an alloy of copper and tin, proved ideal for casting lightweight field guns. Craftsmen worked around the clock, repurposing foundries meant for candle holders and baptismal fonts into artillery workshops. One particularly massive bell, named the Voice of Saint Stephen, yielded enough metal for 3 cannons, each christened with grim humor: the Archbishop, the Deacon, and the Penitent. Their first volley shattered an Ottoman siege tower mid-assembly, a moment so poetic that soldiers reportedly crossed themselves before reloading. Beyond practicality, the act carried profound symbolism. For Vienna's citizens, hearing their beloved bells roar as cannons instead of chimes was a visceral reminder of how far they'd fallen and how fiercely they'd clawed back. Ottoman chroniclers later wrote of their troops' superstitions, whispering that the defenders had blessed their bullets with melted sacraments. The psychological edge was undeniable. Every shot fired was a hymn of defiance, a sacrament of steel. Yet this Masterplan revealed the siege's turning point. Where the Ottomans had once brimmed with confidence, their supply lines now stretched dangerously thin. Kara Mustafa's army, bogged down by weeks of stalled assaults and guerrilla raids, was reaching its breaking point. Vienna's cannons, born from church bells and desperation, were about to face their ultimate test. The defenders, sensing weakness, prepared their boldest move yet, not just to repel the invaders, but to trap them in a vise of their own making. the defenders of Vienna had learned a brutal truth. Sometimes, victory required letting the enemy think they'd already won. The 16th Masterplan was a masterpiece of staged collapse. Under cover of darkness, they quietly abandoned sections of the Leopoldstadt district, leaving behind broken weapons and smoldering campfires to sell the illusion of retreat. When Ottoman scouts crept forward at dawn, they found streets eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of a wounded soldier, actually a militiaman with vinegar-soaked bandages to mimic the stench of infection. The ruse worked too well. Kara Mustafa, convinced the Christians were finally breaking, ordered a full assault. Thousands of Janissaries poured into the district, their crescents glinting in the morning light, only to find themselves funneled into a labyrinth of barricaded alleys. The trap sprang with terrifying precision. Hidden marksmen crouched behind false walls, their muskets trained on choke points where the Ottoman ranks bunched together like sheep in a pen. From rooftops, defenders tipped cauldrons of boiling oil mixed with crushed glass, a gruesome recipe that seared through armor and flesh alike. The real stroke of genius, though, lay in the timing. Just as the Ottomans realized their mistake, Polish lancers emerged from concealed side streets, blocking their retreat. What should have been a triumphant advance became a slaughterhouse, with Ottoman forces pinned between hammer and anvil. History brims with parallels: Napoleon's disastrous march into Russia, Hitler's overextension at Stalingrad. The lesson is timeless. Overconfidence is the precursor to downfall. Kara Mustafa fell for the oldest trick in warfare, mistaking desperation for defeat. His troops, exhausted and hungry after weeks of siege, saw an opening and lunged without questioning why it had appeared so conveniently. Vienna's defenders exploited not just terrain, but human nature itself. Yet the Leopoldstadt ambush revealed another truth: warfare isn't confined to battlefields. As the Ottomans reeled from the trap, the defenders launched a gambit straight from naval playbooks. Despite being miles from the sea, they'd studied Venetian galley tactics, where ships used narrow channels to limit enemy mobility. Now they applied those principles to Vienna's streets, turning the city into an ocean of stone where the Ottomans floundered like sinking ships. The 17th Masterplan would prove that sometimes the best way to fight on land is to think like a sailor. The Danube River, Vienna's lifeline for trade and travel, became its 17th weapon against the Ottomans, not with flowing water, but with deliberate obstruction. As the siege dragged on, defenders realized the river was the invaders' Achilles heel. Ottoman supply barges, heavy with grain from Hungary and gunpowder from Belgrade, relied on the Danube's currents to sustain their massive army. So Vienna's engineers turned the river against them. Under cover of darkness, they stretched massive iron chains across key bends, their links thick as a man's forearm, anchored to sunken barges laden with rubble. These weren't just barriers, they were traps. When the next Ottoman flotilla approached at dawn, the lead vessel slammed into the hidden chain, its hull splintering like kindling. Panicked crews watched as the current pinned their ships sideways, turning them into sitting ducks for Austrian cannons positioned along the banks. The true brilliance lay in the details. The chains weren't static. They could be raised or lowered using winches hidden in ruined mills, allowing friendly boats to slip through while ensnaring enemies. One particularly cunning setup near the Nussdorf sector used floating logs disguised as debris to mask the chain's location until it was too late. The Ottomans, masters of land warfare, found themselves outmaneuvered by tactics borrowed from naval battles centuries old. Venetian merchants, familiar with such riverine defenses from their Adriatic wars, had whispered the idea to Vienna's commanders, proof that even in siege, knowledge flowed as freely as water. History offers eerie parallels. Just as Vienna's chains choked off Ottoman supplies, the Berlin airlift of 1948 bypassed Soviet blockades with airborne convoys. Both were acts of defiance that transformed geography into a weapon, but Vienna's river gambit had a psychological edge. Every stranded barge, every drowned crate of supplies chipped away at the Ottoman army's morale. Starving soldiers began to question why their empire, stretching from Mecca to Budapest, couldn't feed them. Yet for all its ingenuity, the blockade was just one thread in a tapestry of defiance. As the Danube's currents carried wreckage downstream, another force was gathering strength within Vienna's walls, not of steel or strategy, but of spirit. The 18th Masterplan would harness something no cannon could destroy, the unshakable faith of a city that refused to believe it was forsaken. Church bells, silenced for melting, were replaced by something far louder. The voices of thousands, rising in hymns that echoed over the battlefield like a challenge to the heavens. As the siege stretched into its 8th week, Vienna's defenders found strength not in gunpowder or steel, but in something far more potent faith. The 18th Masterplan wasn't drafted in a war room. It unfolded in the city's cobbled streets, where priests led daily processions with icons of the Virgin Mary held high. These weren't just rituals, they were acts of psychological warfare, a defiant reminder that the city's spirit remained unbroken. Workers covered in soot from the forges knelt beside aristocrats in tattered silks, their voices joining in hymns that drowned out the distant thunder of Ottoman cannons. Even the wounded crawled to their windows to wave handkerchiefs as the processions passed, their faces alight with a fervor that pain couldn't extinguish. Rumors of miracles spread like wildfire. A young stable boy claimed to see the ghostly figure of Saint Leopold hovering over the Carinthian gate, his outstretched arms shielding the city from a barrage of Ottoman fire. Another vision, reported by 3 separate sentries, described a spectral army clad in crusader crosses marching along the Danube's misty banks. Skeptics dismissed these as exhaustion-induced hallucinations, but in the suffocating grip of siege, belief became as vital as bread. The city's Jewish population, though exempt from Christian rites, contributed 2 rabbis' organized midnight vigils, their psalms blending with the chants of Carmelite nuns to create an eerie harmony that drifted over the walls. This unity of purpose was no accident. Count Starhemberg, Vienna's pragmatic governor, recognized that shared rituals could bind the city's fractious factions. By orchestrating public blessings for militias before sorties and holding mass in the rubble of shelled churches, he turned piety into a tactical asset. Ottoman deserters later confessed their terror at hearing the defenders' hymns rise even as their own morale crumbled. Faith, it seemed, could blunt the edge of a scimitar. Yet even as Vienna's processions kindled hope, cracks were widening in the Ottoman camp. Kara Mustafa's once unshakable authority now frayed under the strain of failure. Hungarian mercenaries, lured by promises of loot, grumbled over empty purses. Egyptian reinforcements, unused to the autumn chill, huddled around fires burning the last of their ration crates. The Grand Vizier's tent, once a hub of confident strategy sessions, now echoed with whispered accusations. Vienna's defenders, sensing the shift, prepared their boldest gambit yet, one that would exploit not just the enemy's hunger, but their growing distrust. The 19th Masterplan would turn Ottoman against Ottoman, weaving division into the very fabric of their ranks. Whispers slithered through the Ottoman camp like poison, first in the hushed arguments between Kara Mustafa and his field commanders, then in the crumpled letters Vienna's spies plucked from the pockets of dead couriers. The 19th Masterplan targeted the siege's weakest point, not the walls, not the supply lines, but the fraying threads of Ottoman unity. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, once the unquestioned architect of the campaign, now faced mutinous murmurs. His generals resented his refusal to share plunder from captured villages, while Janissary officers bristled at his favoritism toward Balkan auxiliaries. Vienna's intelligence network, sensing the rift, fanned the flames. A forged letter, meticulously stained with tea to mimic Aju, was accidentally dropped where Ottoman scouts would find it, its contents detailing a fictional plot by Mustafa's deputies to blame him for the siege's failures. The deception cut deep. Within days, entire regiments began withholding casualty reports, fearing their losses would be used against them. Hungarian cavalrymen, crucial for scouting, abandoned their posts after intercepting another planted missive that implied Mustafa planned to sacrifice them in the next assault. The Grand Vizier's response only worsened the crisis. He ordered the execution of 2 officers for treasonous gossip, igniting fresh outrage. Vienna's defenders watched from the walls as Ottoman discipline unraveled, their once precise siege works now marred by delays and half-hearted assaults. Nightfall became the crucible of these fractures. Under cover of darkness, Vienna's agents slipped into the Ottoman camp disguised as water carriers, spreading rumors tailored to each faction. To the Anatolian troops, they whispered that Mustafa favored European conscripts. To the artillery crews, they hinted that Janissaries were hoarding rations. The seeds of paranoia sprouted swiftly. By dawn, entire divisions were refusing to coordinate, each suspecting the other of sabotage. Modern psychological operations, from Allied black propaganda in World War II to digital disinformation campaigns, still employ these tactics, proving that the most fragile part of any army isn't its weapons, but the trust binding it together. As the Ottomans' cohesion crumbled, Vienna's commanders seized their next opportunity. The cover of night, already a canvas for deception, would now become a theater of audacity. While the enemy camp buzzed with accusations, a hand-picked strike force prepared to execute the 20th Masterplan, one that would turn darkness itself into a weapon. Their target, the very heart of Ottoman power, Kara Mustafa's command tent. Darkness became Vienna's greatest ally as the defenders unleashed their 20th Masterplan, a symphony of shadows where small, lethal teams slipped through the Ottoman lines like ghosts. These weren't traditional soldiers but hand-picked volunteers, hunters who could track by sound, locksmiths skilled at picking latches, even actors who mimicked Ottoman sentries' accents to bluff their way past checkpoints. Their mission was chaos, not to defeat the enemy in open battle, but to make their camps feel like a nightmare. One moonless night, a team of 6 crept toward an Ottoman powder magazine near the Crotentum sector. Disguised as Hungarian laborers, they rolled barrels marked flour, right up to the depot barrels packed with slow-burning fuses and crushed glass. By the time guards noticed the hissing sparks, the raiders had vanished into the maze of tents, leaving behind an explosion that lit up the sky like false dawn. The blast incinerated enough gunpowder to sustain the siege for weeks, and the shockwave rattled teacups in Kara Mustafa's own tent. The raid's brilliance lay in its simplicity. While the Ottomans braced for mass assaults, Vienna's saboteurs struck where they felt safest behind their own lines. One team poisoned a well by dropping sacks of spoiled meat down its shaft. Another loosened the axle bolts on artillery carriages, so the next time the cannons rolled forward, their wheels collapsed mid-salvo. Modern special forces, from Navy SEALs sabotaging enemy infrastructure to Ukrainian partisans disabling Russian supply trains, still operate on these same principles. The goal isn't just destruction, it's the erosion of an enemy's sense of security, turning their own bases into places of paranoia. Yet for all their lethality, these night raids revealed something deeper about Vienna's defenders, their ability to adapt roles instantly. A blacksmith who forged nails by day might become a saboteur by night, then return to his anvil by dawn as if nothing happened. This fluidity set the stage for the next Masterplan, where the line between civilian and combatant would blur entirely, not in the shadows but in broad daylight. The defenders were about to prove that even their children could become weapons. The rigid battle lines of medieval warfare crumbled under Vienna's desperate innovation, giving birth to the 21st Masterplan fluid, adaptive formations that turned the city's defenders into a chameleon on the battlefield. Where Ottoman forces relied on traditional massed ranks of Janissaries with towering shields and curved swords, Vienna's commanders mixed pikes, muskets, and halberds into hybrid units that could reshape themselves mid-combat. A single company might start as a bristling square of pikes to repel cavalry, then fracture into scattered musket teams to pick off enemy officers, only to reform moments later as a wedge to punch through weakened lines. This wasn't just flexibility, it was tactical metamorphosis. The secret lay in the interplay between old and new. Austrian veterans who'd grown up with pike formations now fought alongside German mercenaries schooled in the latest volley fire techniques. When Ottoman waves crashed against Vienna's barricades, these mixed units responded with brutal efficiency. Pikemen held the line while musketeers fired staggered shots from behind, their smoke creating a haze that masked repositioning. One Polish observer described the effect as a porcupine that spat lightning, referencing the pike's defensive spines and the musket's flashing barrels. The Ottomans, trained to exploit predictable formations, found themselves slashing at air as Vienna's defenders flowed like water around their assaults. This revolution didn't happen by accident. Drill masters ran defenders through relentless exercises, rehearsing how to pivot from shield walls into skirmish lines at the blast of a whistle. Even civilians were taught basic signals. A raised flag might order rooftop snipers to concentrate fire on enemy drummers, while a trumpet blast could summon reserve units to plug gaps. The death of rigid medieval tactics wasn't just a shift in weapons, it was a transformation of mindset. Vienna's soldiers fought not as cogs in a machine, but as a living organism responding to threats in real time. Yet for all their ingenuity, the defenders knew one truth: no formation could hold forever against the Ottoman tide. That's when they turned to unexpected allies, creatures far older than any empire. As pike squares braced for the next assault, the 22nd Masterplan was already stirring in the stables, where four-legged warriors stood ready to charge into history. The howls that pierced the Ottoman trenches weren't human, they were the war dogs of Vienna, the 22nd Masterplan, in a siege where even the animals fought like demons. These weren't pets but specialized killers, mastiffs and wolfhounds trained to hunt in the tunnels beneath the city. When Ottoman sappers dug too close, handlers released them into the darkness, their muzzles strapped with spiked collars to tear at enemy legs in the cramped passages. The effect was pandemonium. Janissaries who'd faced cannon fire without flinching scrambled over each other to escape the snarling shadows, their lanterns revealing flashes of bared teeth and matted fur. One Ottoman survivor later wrote of a tunnel where the only sound was panting breath before the devil's own hounds dragged down 3 miners in seconds, their screams muffled under growls and the wet crunch of bone. But the dogs' true power was psychological. Unlike human attackers, they couldn't be reasoned with or bribed. Their loyalty was absolute, their violence instinctive. Handlers amplified the terror by strapping burning brands to some dogs' backs, turning them into living torches that charged blindly through enemy camps, igniting tents and scattering horses. The Ottomans, whose faith considered dogs unclean, saw them as literal instruments of hell, a superstition Vienna exploited mercilessly. When a particularly massive hound named Berserker dragged a wounded officer back to the city gates by his sash, defenders displayed the shredded uniform like a trophy, knowing word would spread through the enemy ranks. The ethics of weaponizing animals sparked debate even then. Some priests argued that beasts lacked souls and therefore couldn't sin in battle, while others condemned the practice as barbaric. Records show at least one nobleman refusing to donate his prized hunting dogs, calling it a degradation of God's creatures, yet the grim calculus of survival won out. A single dog could disrupt a tunneling operation for hours, buying time that saved hundreds of human lives. Modern parallels, from World War I's messenger pigeons to today's bomb-sniffing military dogs, prove that animals remain both tools and casualties of war. As the last canine teams returned bloodied but victorious from the tunnels, Vienna's commanders turned their eyes to the horizon. The siege's final act was approaching, and the 23rd Masterplan would demand not just courage, but something far rarer: the willingness to abandon everything familiar and charge headlong into the unknown. The dogs had bought them one last night to prepare. By dawn, the city would either be liberated or reduced to ashes. Dawn broke over Vienna on September 12, 1683, not with silence but with a thunderous roar as Sobieski's forces launched their 23rd Masterplan, a coordinated assault from 3 directions at once. Polish Winged Hussars charged from the western hills like a tempest of steel, their lances glinting in the morning sun. Bavarian infantry advanced from the north in tight squares, their disciplined volleys shredding Ottoman ranks. Meanwhile, Imperial Austrian troops struck from the city gates, pouring through breaches in the walls like a flood unleashed. This wasn't just an attack, it was a symphony of violence, each movement calculated to splinter the enemy's focus. The hammer and anvil tactic unfolded with brutal precision. Sobieski's cavalry, the hammer, drove the Ottomans toward the anvil, Vienna's reinforced defenses, where waiting musketeers and pikemen cut down anyone who staggered too close. The Janissaries, elite warriors who had once seemed invincible, now found themselves pinned between 2 nightmares. One survivor later wrote of the terror: "To face the Poles' lances was death, to flee toward the city walls was madness, and to stand still was to be crushed between them." The Ottomans' famed discipline crumbled under the strain, their ranks dissolving into chaos as officers shouted conflicting orders. Timing was everything. Sobieski had spent days studying the Ottoman camp's rhythms, waiting for the moment their night watch would be exhausted and their dawn patrols not yet deployed. His scouts had even noted when the enemy's horses were watered, a detail that ensured the Hussars' charge would meet scattered resistance. Modern military theorists still marvel at the synchronization, how 18,000 horsemen could descend a slope in perfect unison while miles away. Austrian gunners timed their barrages to coincide with the cavalry's impact. It was a dance of destruction choreographed down to the second. As the sun climbed higher, the battlefield became a slaughterhouse. Ottoman tents burned, their silken banners trampled into the mud. Kara Mustafa's grand pavilion, once a symbol of invincible power, stood abandoned, its treasures gold-threaded robes, jeweled daggers, even the Grand Vizier's personal coffee set left behind in his frantic retreat. The siege of Vienna was over, but the lessons of its final hours would echo far beyond that blood-soaked field. Amid the cheers of liberated citizens and the groans of the wounded, a quieter drama unfolded. Vienna's defenders, though victorious, faced a new challenge, the grim aftermath of siege. Starving survivors stumbled through ruined streets, their homes reduced to rubble. Wounded soldiers crowded makeshift hospitals, their injuries festering in the late summer heat. And lurking beneath the celebration was an invisible threat, disease, the ancient scourge of armies and cities alike. The 24th Masterplan wouldn't involve swords or cannons, but something far more delicate, the race to rebuild, to heal, and to ensure that survival didn't give way to ruin. The battle was won, but the war for Vienna's future had only just begun. The Ottoman retreat from Vienna should have been a chance to regroup. Instead, it became a slaughter. The 24th Masterplan was simple: never let a broken enemy recover. King Sobieski's cavalry, still fresh despite weeks of siege, transformed into hunters, chasing the fleeing Ottomans for miles. This wasn't just a rout, it was systematic annihilation. Polish Hussars and German dragoons cut down stragglers, while Croatian light cavalry harried the flanks, turning every hill and forest into a killing ground. Kara Mustafa's once proud army, now a panicked mob, abandoned wagons of treasure, siege engines, even wounded comrades in their desperation to escape. The roads east were littered with discarded weapons and the bloated corpses of pack animals, their bloated forms drawing carrion birds like a macabre harvest. History offers a grim lesson here: overextension kills. The Ottomans had stretched their supply lines too thin, banking everything on Vienna's swift fall. When the tide turned, their exhausted troops had no fortified camps to retreat to, no depots of fresh horses or stockpiled grain. Modern militaries call this culminating point, the moment an advance outpaces its ability to sustain itself. The parallels are stark. Napoleon's Grand Army disintegrated during the retreat from Moscow, just as Hitler's Sixth Army starved at Stalingrad. Vienna's defenders understood that victory isn't just about winning battles, but exploiting the enemy's collapse with relentless precision. Yet the pursuit tactics revealed something deeper about warfare's evolution. Sobieski's forces didn't just chase, they coordinated. Hussar squadrons used flag signals to funnel Ottomans into pre-arranged ambushes, while infantry units methodically secured choke points. This wasn't wild aggression, it was a scalpel compared to the Janissaries' scimitar. Today's shock and awe doctrine echoes this philosophy. Overwhelming force matters less than controlled, sustained pressure that shatters an enemy's will to fight. As the last Ottoman stragglers vanished beyond the horizon, Vienna's survivors faced a different kind of battle, one not of swords and cannon, but of memory. The 25th and final Masterplan wasn't written on parchment or shouted across battlefields. It was etched into the very stones of the city, a lesson for generations yet unborn. True victory isn't just surviving the storm, but ensuring the world never forgets how you weathered it. The bells that had fallen silent during Vienna's darkest hours now rang across Europe, their peals carrying news of a victory so improbable it was called divine. The 25th Masterplan wasn't fought with pikes or gunpowder, but with ink and parchment, a propaganda campaign that transformed survival into legend. Within weeks of the Ottoman retreat, crude woodcut prints circulated from Paris to Prague, depicting winged angels hovering over Vienna's walls, their swords bathed in celestial fire. Pamphleteers, those early influencers of public opinion, spun tales of Saint Michael himself leading Sobieski's charge, while broadsheets listed miraculous signs: a crucifix found unscorched in a burned church, a well that sprang fresh water the moment the last Turk fled. The message was clear: God had chosen sides. Artists immortalized the siege in towering canvases, each brushstroke a deliberate act of myth-making. One famous painting showed King Sobieski on horseback, his face bathed in golden light as he accepted Kara Mustafa's surrendered banner, a scene that never happened, but felt truer than reality to audiences hungry for triumph. Churches displayed captured Ottoman standards like holy relics, while playwrights staged melodramas where Janissaries trembled at the sight of a priest holding aloft the Eucharist. This wasn't just celebration, it was narrative warfare, shaping how future generations would remember the clash. The Ottomans, meanwhile, told their own version. Official dispatches blamed the defeat on treacherous weather and rebellious mercenaries, never admitting the ingenuity of their foes. The true power of these stories lay in their ripple effects. Vienna's survival didn't just halt the Ottoman advance, it shattered the myth of their invincibility. European princes who had once paid tribute to the Sultan now smelled blood in the water, launching campaigns that would push the Ottomans back to the Balkans. The siege legacy even birthed a culinary legend, the kwasa, its crescent shape a mockery of the Ottoman emblem, allegedly created by Viennese bakers to celebrate their defiance. But beyond the symbols and sermons, the most enduring lesson was this: victory isn't just won on battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of those who tell the tale. The same strategies that saved Vienna: adaptability, unity, the relentless will to innovate echo in every challenge where the underdog refuses to stay down. Whether in boardrooms or personal struggles, the siege teaches us that walls may crumble, but the stories we build around them can outlast empires. And sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a cannon, but the unshakable belief that against all odds you will endure. The Siege of Vienna didn't just produce 25 tactical masterplans, it revealed something far greater about the nature of victory itself. At its core, this wasn't a story of walls or weapons, but of human ingenuity refusing to surrender to the inevitable. Each strategy, from the beacon signals flickering through the night to the war dogs snarling in the tunnels, was a testament to the same unshakable truth: innovation thrives under pressure. When the Ottomans arrived with the finest siege engines of their age, Vienna's defenders answered with something no empire could predict: the relentless adaptability of ordinary people pushed to extraordinary lengths. Consider the audacity of melting church bells into cannons. Here was a city so desperate it transformed symbols of peace into instruments of war, proving that true resilience isn't about preserving tradition, but reimagining it. Or the citizen militias, bakers and blacksmiths who turned their everyday tools into weapons, showing that courage isn't the sole domain of soldiers. Even the grand cavalry charge, often remembered as Sobieski's triumph, was only possible because of the unsung scouts who mapped Ottoman weaknesses and the diplomats who stitched together a coalition from fragments of distrust. Vienna's victory wasn't a single masterstroke, but a mosaic of countless small acts of defiance, each one a lesson in turning limitations into strengths. These strategies echo far beyond the 17th century. Imagine applying Vienna's beacon system to modern cybersecurity, where encrypted signals could outmaneuver digital sieges. Picture businesses like the Holy League uniting rivals against common threats instead of clinging to old rivalries. The siege teaches us that the most formidable walls aren't made of stone, but of shared purpose, whether in a medieval city or a 21st century boardroom. And just as Vienna's spies sowed discord in enemy ranks, today's leaders might harness the power of perception, using information as deftly as any sword. But perhaps the most enduring lesson isn't tactical at all. It's the reminder that history's greatest underdogs didn't win by matching their opponent's strength, but by rewriting the rules entirely. Vienna's defenders didn't have the Ottomans' numbers or resources. They had something far more potent: the willingness to try the untried, to blur the lines between soldier and civilian, to turn every obstacle into an opportunity. That's the real blueprint they left behind, not just for surviving sieges, but for overcoming any overwhelming odds. So now we turn to you. What modern challenges, whether in leadership, technology, or personal struggles, could these timeless tactics solve? How might we channel Vienna's blend of creativity and courage in our own battles? Share your thoughts below, and if you're hungry for more untold strategies that shaped our world, don't forget to subscribe. Because history isn't just about the past, it's a toolbox for the future, waiting for the next generation of underdogs to pick up where Vienna